Hello, I'm Brigantia Blackbird of Blackbird's Brew. Happy Sunday and welcome to Norse Studies Week 2. We will begin with the Heathen Handbook. The Heathen Awakening is the first section I focused upon, and it's all about the resurgence of paganism and heathenry. The authors credit this to many people taking a closer look at their ancestral roots, which leads them to ancestral beliefs and traditions. Despite the many centuries of Christian dominance in many parts of the world, the reality remains that it is not a homegrown religion to anywhere but the Middle East. The god of Abraham originates in a Mesopotamian pantheon, originally considered one of the 70 sons of El and Asherah. He was a god of the wind and the storms, not an almighty god, not the head of the pantheon. And it was only in later centuries that this particular god was considered to be the husband of Asherah, and then later on declared to be the god above all other gods, and then finally the only god by his followers. Whether the conversion and conquest of Abrahamic religions was the idea of this deity or just his ambitious followers, that can be debated. But despite those face long years of existence, they are still a transplanted religion everywhere except the Middle East. Europe, the Americas, Africa, Australia, Asia. The God of Abraham and the religions he inspired really have nothing to do with anyone else in the world. The only reason why anyone today believes that the God of Abraham is the God is because his followers kept saying that he was for a few thousand years until no one living remembered any other idea. And that is literally the only reason why it has endured. Now, the next section of the book was about sources. And the authors were upfront that there's a mix of good and bad information out there, and sorting, between the two is a job in and of itself. They defined what is considered to be the primary sources, which are books written by the contemporaries of heathens or their immediate descendants. And this would include Roman historians, epic poems, the Icelandic sagas, and this comprises what is called the lore. Secondary sources are described as modern books that make use of the primary sources, archaeology, etymology, and other forms of research to try to get a better idea of what our ancestors were up to and why. And then there's other books that are absolute drivel, or as the authors called it, hogwash. The usual characteristics of such books is an attempt to tie in New Age ideas or foreign religious systems in with heathenry. Suffice it to say, the authors do not buy into the idea that all gods and religions are the same and they can just be conflated with one another, and I tend to agree with that assessment. The next several sections of the book get into the ancestral roots of heathen peoples. For we have the Indo-Europeans who lived at the foot of the glaciers approximately 12,000 to 15,000 years ago. Then in the second or third millennium BCE, which is before the Common Era, we have Aryans arrive on the scene from the steppes. And then from there, we begin to see the development of various cultures broadly categorized as Celts, Slavs, and Germanic peoples. When it comes to who is and is not our ancestors, it's more of a question of how far back in time do we look? Because the answer to that question will depend upon the era we examine. At one point, the population of Europe was essentially one people, and the separation into different tribes and then different nations evolved over many centuries. Now, let's move on to the Norse creation myth. It begins with Ginnungagap. I'm not sure if my pronunciation is better or worse than last week. You decide. But this translates as either empty void or the mighty void. And according to Snorri, on one side of the gap is Niflheimer, roughly meaning fog home, and on the other is Muspel, which is a fiery place. So when I got to thinking about this idea of an empty void or a mighty void, it got me to thinking of a concept within witchcraft known as both the tomb and the womb. Essentially, the tomb of existence is also the womb of the goddess, and things that are dead go into it, things come out of it living. It's a place of where the spark of creation can take place, and that's kind of what made me that's just where my mind went. I thought that was a very natural place, and you'll see why that was reinforced as we go along. And Niflheimer, there's a well And from that well, water flows into the Gunga Gap and it freezes in that void. But once the ice gets close to Muspel, it melts, and from this, the process through which Ymir came into being. He was the first creature born. So it sounds like to me that this empty void having the fluids of creation and then being sparked through that fiery muspel, it just sounds very much like the process of conception as we would understand it today, of the egg and the sperm meeting in the void that is the womb, coming together and sparking new life. It sounds like a very similar process, and it makes sense as a metaphor. And really, if we think about this in terms of the formation of solar systems and everything else, the Wisdom of Odin channel actually got into this when he talked about the Norse creation myth. He said one of the things that we are taught is that the Earth may have begun as a icy planetoid. It was crashed into by another planetoid that was more molten lava-y, and they came together, and that might have been the formation of both the Earth and of the Moon, and that these exchange of energies is actually what created water and landmass and all of the other elements and everything that we now know to be our home planet. So it's interesting that maybe our ancestors may have picked up on kind of the broad themes of this, and it just became more metaphor once it was translated into story. So, going on to Ymir, who's essentially the first Jotun. And again, Dr. Jackson Crawford's video reminded us that Jotun, while it does mean giant, it doesn't necessarily mean giant in size. It simply refers to a different tribe of deities. Now, it's thought that Ymir would sweat in his sleep, and then the sweat would turn into Jotun, and that somehow there was some kind of something going on with his legs, and his legs were reproducing, and that created other Jotun. Very, very strange. And then the second being that came into existence was Aldhamla, which was a cow. Apparently, this cow was licking ice in Gunga Gap, or licking stones, salty stones in Gunga Gap. A little unclear about that, but through this process it produced Buri, who is an ancestor of the Aesir. And then this brings us to Buri, who got together with Bestla, who was a Jotun woman, and together they had Odin, Vili, and Ve. Now, for reasons that weren't fully defined, Odin and his brothers did decide to kill Ymir and tear apart his body. It's said that the flow of blood from Ymir turned into the oceans, and then his flesh becomes the earth, his bones the mountains, and his teeth the boulders. And Ymir's eyelashes became the fence that surrounds Midgard, and his brains became clouds, and his skull is used to make the sky, and that this sky is held up by four dwarves who are named Nordri, Vestri, Sudri, and Astri. And the interesting thing about the origins of the dwarves is that they were once thought to be maggots on the flesh of Ymir. So, not necessarily the most appetizing of imagery, but it's a very interesting metaphor, and I think there's a more literal truth in it than what we might realize. Not literal as in we ripped apart this dude and formed a world, but rather whenever a new civilization comes into being, it is still using the components of the old. It might be repurposing them, as we see in this myth. It might be changing things around. It might be trying to evolve the process of using them. But whatever it is still lying on the foundations of that which is old and dead. And really, the idea of the creation itself is very much in tune with the idea of perhaps that is what came out of a previous kind of Ragnarok. We know that when a star collapses and it forms a black hole, all the matter surrounding goes in, and then what's theorized is all that matter eventually gets shot out of a white hole. And so you have this eventual recreation, and it's all this big recycling system. And that's where my thoughts are really taking me. So now for humans, because, creation story, obviously it's all about us. At least that's how we always treat it. But humans were said to be created by Odin, Hunir, who appears in the creation tale and in the story of Ragnarok, and Loder, who may or may not be Loki in another guise. That is one possibility amongst many, but it is a possibility, so I bring it up. So what happens is that they're walking along one day. They find this driftwood called Askar and Embla, and then they decided to make something of them. And they gave this driftwood their wit, their spirit, their breath, and a human appearance. And then let's see, it was Snorri that actually specified that they were originally driftwood, but that Asker means ash tree, Embla could mean elm, but the exact meaning of Embla is somewhat disputed. I have also seen it translated as elder, but again, controversial. And then that brings us to the fact that Asker, it means ash tree, and Yggdrasil is an ash tree, so that's an interesting correlation there. And of course, Yggdrasil is also the great fate tree that is beneath the earth. And at its roots, we have the Well of Urdur, which is one of the Norns. And it also says that Yggdrasil actually has three main roots. One is in Hell, one is in Jotunheim, and one is in Midgard, or possibly Asgard, depending on who you ask and what you read. Now, the root that's in Hell is chewed on by Nidhogger, which is a large serpent. And how all the worlds and the nine realms fit together on Yggdrasil and what the worlds are, that's the subject of considerable speculation, and firm conclusions can't really be drawn based upon currently known information, but of course everyone has their own opinions on that. Then we have the Bifrost as the bridge between Midgard and Asgard. And the interesting thing about it being the bridge is that it isn't just connecting Midgard to Asgard, or, our realm to the realm of the gods. It's also said to be a rainbow bridge. And this is where the authors of the Heathen Handbook might get a bit cross with me. But I can't help but think of the rainbow bridge and compare it to the rainbow of the chakra system. Now, of course, with the chakra system, as you get the energy flowing properly through each chakra, it gets you in touch ultimately with the divine. So perhaps traveling on the Bifrost, getting to the realm of the gods, also involves traveling along our own chakras, getting them in order, clearing those out so that we can traverse them and we can form that connection. But again, that is speculation on my part. Then, and elsewhere in Norse cosmology, we have the moon and the sun, which are referred to both as people and also as separate things. We have Mani, who is essentially the moon god who pulls the moon. And then we have Sol, or sometimes called Suna, who represents the sun and pulls the sun in chariots. And of course, they are chased by the wolves Hati and Skoll, which means hatred and boldness. So, okay. And then finally, the stars and the lights in the sky are said to be sparks from Muspel itself, cast up against the skull of Ymir. So it's really interesting and fascinating imagery. And I've only gone a little bit into the metaphor of it all, but it's something that I'll probably be returning to and referencing in future videos. Now this brings me to a discovery of Nordic witchcraft. I've been watching the Freyja Norling videos. I watched episodes 2 through 4 of her first season of A Discovery of Nordic Witchcraft. Episode 2 is about how to connect with the goddess Frigg. I was particularly interested in this video because last November I began researching about Frigg, who's also called Frigga, and I just felt drawn towards her. And to my surprise, Loki seemed to encourage this. So it's been on my to-do list for a little while to get better acquainted with this goddess. Now, Freyja Norling began her video by explaining that the gods are truly individuals and independent. I concur. When or if they choose to have dealings with humanity, it occurs on their own terms and their own timetable, and in the manner in which they see fit. And the involvement could be direct or indirect. And each individual person's relationship with a deity is likely to be different from another individual's, because different personalities interact differently with each other. And the reason why a god might take an interest in one person may not be the same reason why they take an interest in someone else. So that can account, at least to a certain degree, why some devotees of the same deity might have wildly different experiences. It could just be the result of different personalities coming together and interacting. Frigga, of course, is the All-Mother, the Lady of Asgard. She knows the fate of every living thing. She's considered by some to be a goddess of needlecraft and thread, but Freyja Norling really said that she is a goddess of the whole household, and any act that cleanses, beautifies, or strengthens the home can honor Frigga, and it can be an act of magic in and of itself, which, if you've been following my Pagan Housewife series, you'll see this is very much in line with my own personal philosophy. I think it can take on a sacred nature if we approach it properly. Frigga can also teach us to connect with our ancestors and how to connect with them, and about re-examining our ideas about feminine strength and power. She's a source of considerable wisdom, and also how to transmit that wisdom throughout the generations. Frigga shows us how the divine can manifest in the most grounded of ways, that simplicity can be a very powerful magic, and domestic work and becoming the center of a family is both honorable and powerful. And then Freya Norling suggests performing what she called a mirror meditation in order to attempt to connect with Frigg, which I might be doing. What you do, apparently, is gaze into a mirror and reflect upon how Frigga manifests within you, where you accept her energies and where you block her. And then after you have a sense of essentially what the status of that relationship is, jar Rune or go meditate or go for a walk in nature and see if the image of a rune comes to you, and then reflect upon that. And whatever rune that might come to your attention from whatever means, it's intended to be a guidance in that moment, and we should meditate on the information about that for the next 7 nights. So the next video I watched of hers, which was episode 3 of the first season, is Norse runes for witchcraft. She explained that rune means mystery or secret, and that each rune is a sound which relates to a name, and the meaning which can be interpreted in a variety of ways, that they are energies that we interact with, either cooperatively or in opposition to. These threads of energies are all connected to the weird, which is likened to a spider web. Using the runes can give us knowledge about these energies as well as provide guidance in life. They can be used for divination. They define the issues that we're facing and how our personal energy is affecting the situation and what energetic currents we are surrounded by. And that to work with these runes is to come in harmony with the energies of the universe, to be enfolded within them and be brought into the larger pattern. Now, while the runes are a writing system, they are not only a writing system, and they can be used for magic, healing, and divination. And this is where Freya Norling referenced a verse from the Havamal that strongly directed that one should not be carving runes or using them until they understand what they are and how to handle them. So interesting caution there. And then the fourth video in season 1 is called the Uthark rune theory. And the question is, and essentially, is it Uthark or is it Futhark? This was a completely new idea for me, new information, wasn't sure what to expect. But she said that the Uthark theory originated in the 1930s from a university in Sweden, a particular professor who, I am sorry, I just could not quite catch his name when I was listening to the video. But there we go. I'm sure I'll come across his name at some point. And the idea is that what we would consider to be the Futhark rune row should actually begin with Uruz, and that this row is actually a cipher. And if you start with Uruz, it'll better match up with numerology or Kabbalah, because the theory is that the runic system is based upon early Mediterranean language, which, you know, it's a possibility. So what you do is you move the rune Fehu to the back of the line, and then you move the rune Uruz to the first position and assign it the number 1. And this, in the opinion of some people, gave a better flow to all of the runes in this series and their magical meanings. And then she explained something that I had not really read about before, is that runes are thought to have a lighter outer form, which is kind of the outside edges of them, and then a darker inner form. And it's in the darker form that we find the deeper meaning. And that's really what we strive for in the study of the runes. She said that the rune Uruz means the beginning or the dawn of time, the start of a people, and that does lend psychological weight to the theory that maybe it does belong in front. I mean, it's an interesting idea. It's all brand new to me. I'm not in a position to have formed an opinion of my own just yet, but I think there's value in examining various theories, because even if it seems to be very much out of left field and without perhaps the strongest of foundations, sometimes wild ideas can ultimately be correct, or they can serve as a stepping stone to more solid information, or they can be a useful contrast when studying and training the mind to look at things from as many different angles as possible. So that is what I have gotten up to this week. Next week, I will, of course, be going further into the Heathen Handbook. I will be doing more with this discovery of Nordic witchcraft. In some ways, she seems in her philosophy to be somewhat opposed to what I'm reading in the Heathen Handbook, so it'll be interesting to continue comparing and contrasting that and just seeing what I ultimately think about it all. But then I also want to focus a little bit on Ragnarok. We had creation of the world this week. I want to have the destruction of that world next week because I do have some ideas there that I've been kind of tossing around in my brain for a little while. And of course, I want to look deeply into what other people are teaching about that as too. So hopefully you will be back for that. If you have any thoughts of your own, if you are studying anything having to do with Norse spirituality yourself, I would love to hear all about it. You can tell me about it in the comments section below, or do one better, join the Gilded group. There's a link to do so in the description box, and it's called Blackbird's Brew. Click on the link, takes it to us, and we can start having some conversation and comparing notes. So hope to see you soon, and that'll do it for this video. So until next time, bye-bye.